Surely right now in Germany he's very popular. Who? Schürrle. Andre Schürrle.
He was the golden boy of German football, a man so untouchable they called him der Kaiser. But even a king has enemies. Behind the trophies, the elegance, and the spotlight, there were players who clashed with Franz Beckenbauer. Some mocked him, others resented him, and a few went as far as to despise him. Today we uncover the 5 players who couldn't stand the man the world worshipped. In the summer of 1986, the German national team arrived in Mexico chasing World Cup glory. Franz Beckenbauer, then just a few years into his role as manager, carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. He had the elegance of a former superstar and the authority of a commander, but not everyone in that locker room saw him as untouchable. One man in particular, goalkeeper Uli Stein, would ignite one of the most embarrassing scandals in Beckenbauer's career. Stein was no ordinary backup. At Hamburg, he was known for his fiery personality, quick reflexes, and even quicker temper. But in Mexico, he was firmly in the shadow of Toni Schumacher, who Beckenbauer trusted as his number one. For a competitive goalkeeper like Stein, sitting on the bench felt like humiliation, and when frustration boiled over, he chose the most dangerous outlet possible, mocking the boss. Behind closed doors, Stein reportedly called Beckenbauer Suppenkasper, a childish nickname ripped from a German children's tale, but also a sharp jab at the coach's past. Years earlier, Beckenbauer had starred in soup commercials on German television. To fans, those ads were harmless, even charming. To Stein, they were ammunition. By calling him Suppenkasper, Stein wasn't just teasing, he was branding Beckenbauer as a clown, a sellout, a man more interested in ads than the game. The insult could have stayed a private joke, the kind of locker room jab that blows over in a few days. But whispers travel fast, especially when they involve a legend like Beckenbauer. Soon, the nickname leaked outside the squad. German media got hold of it. What had started as an offhand insult spiraled into a full-blown scandal. Beckenbauer's response was swift and merciless. Uli Stein was immediately kicked out of the World Cup squad and sent home from Mexico. Imagine that. You've worked your entire career for a chance on the biggest stage, and suddenly you're packing your bags in disgrace. For Stein, the dream ended in an airport terminal, while his teammates continued fighting in the tournament. But here's where it gets more interesting. Stein later insisted the whole thing was blown out of proportion. In his version, the nickname was harmless banter, never meant to be disrespectful. Some of his teammates even agreed, hinting that Beckenbauer had overreacted. Others whispered a darker theory that the nickname gave Beckenbauer an excuse to remove a player who had already been a thorn in his side. Because let's be clear, Stein's frustration wasn't only about jokes. Rumors swirled that Beckenbauer's loyalty to Schumacher wasn't purely based on performance. There were whispers of sponsor influence, Adidas connections, and political maneuvering in the background. Stein felt ignored, overlooked, and maybe even betrayed. And when emotions run that high, even a silly nickname can become the spark for an explosion. The fallout was brutal. Stein's international career was effectively ruined. Though he continued to play at club level, the label of being the man who mocked Beckenbauer never really left him. For Beckenbauer, on the other hand, the incident cemented his authority. He had made an example out of Stein, sending a clear message: disrespect me and you're gone. What makes the Suppenkasper affair so fascinating is how small it was on the surface. A nickname, a joke, but how deeply it revealed the tensions within Beckenbauer's reign. It showed that even der Kaiser wasn't universally loved, that behind the polite interviews and shining reputation, cracks existed, and those cracks would only grow in the years to come. Because the truth is, Stein wasn't the only player who felt slighted. The goalkeeper battle itself, Stein versus Schumacher, raised even more questions about favoritism, politics, and Beckenbauer's power. And that's where the next clash begins. If Uli Stein's Suppenkasper jab was the spark, then the goalkeeper debate in 1986 was the fire smoldering underneath. To understand it, you need to know the context. West Germany had 2 top-tier keepers, and both were strong personalities. Toni Schumacher, the established number 1, was famous for his reliability but also notorious for his temper and controversial antics. Uli Stein, meanwhile, was hungry, aggressive, and desperate to prove he could take over the position. Beckenbauer had to choose between them. And like any decision in football, it wasn't just about who had the safer hands. Some claimed Beckenbauer's loyalty to Schumacher went deeper than tactics. Schumacher was tied closely to Adidas, the sporting giant that practically ruled German football in the 1980 seconds. Beckenbauer himself had long-standing links to the company. Rumors began swirling that sponsor politics played just as much of a role as raw ability in determining who stood between the posts. For Stein, this was infuriating. He believed he'd done enough at Hamburg to earn more respect. Instead, he sat on the bench, forced to watch Schumacher command the spotlight. Every time he trained, every time he warmed up only to return to the bench, the frustration grew. By the time the Suppenkasper incident exploded, it wasn't just about a nickname. It was the boiling point of years of feeling ignored. And the fallout wasn't limited to Stein. The squad itself felt the ripples. Players wondered if decisions were being made on merit or on marketing. Some quietly sided with Stein, though few dared to speak publicly. Others doubled down in loyalty to Beckenbauer, seeing his hardline response as necessary to protect authority in the middle of a World Cup. The irony? Despite all the chaos, Beckenbauer's Germany still reached the final, only to lose 3-2 to Diego Maradona's Argentina. But for Stein, that was no consolation. He wasn't even there to see it. And when he returned home, the German press painted him as a troublemaker, the man foolish enough to insult a legend. This episode marked a turning point. Beckenbauer had made his stance clear. No one challenged his authority and survived. Yet, the conflict also exposed the fragile underbelly of his reign. Behind the image of a smooth, untouchable leader, there were whispers of favoritism, corporate influence, and unhappy players. And those whispers would grow louder when Beckenbauer went after his own teammates with words far sharper than Suppenkasper, because just 2 years earlier, he'd already shocked the football world with a public attack on his own countrymen. 2 years before the drama in Mexico, Beckenbauer had already proven that he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it meant turning the knife on his fellow German players. In 1984, West Germany had crashed out of the European Championship in embarrassing fashion. Fans were furious, the press was brutal, and Beckenbauer, still seen as a football statesman, decided to make his opinion known. He didn't hold back. In a now infamous remark, he called the national players sated and overpaid. To him, they had lost the hunger that once defined German football. They weren't warriors anymore, they were celebrities, too comfortable in their high salaries and endorsements. Imagine being one of those players, already humiliated by failure, only to hear Der Kaiser, the man you admired, the man whose shadow you played in, publicly accuse you of laziness. It wasn't just criticism, it was a slap in the face. For many, it felt like Beckenbauer was putting distance between himself and the mess, throwing them under the bus to protect his own image. Some players quietly seethed, others brushed it off as just Beckenbauer being Beckenbauer. But the words stuck. Footballers talk, and in the tight-knit world of the national team, resentment lingers. He was no longer just the elegant leader who had carried Germany to glory in 1974. He was now the outspoken critic, the man who demanded perfection but didn't hesitate to shame his peers when they fell short. What's striking is how calculated it seemed. Beckenbauer knew his words carried weight, and by calling players sated and overpaid, he was sending a message: I'm above this, and I won't be dragged down by mediocrity. It reinforced his image as a man apart, someone more emperor than teammate. But emperors rarely win popularity contests inside their own courts. This moment planted a seed of quiet hostility among certain players. And it also showed the world that Beckenbauer didn't need locker room drama to create enemies. He could manufacture them with nothing more than a quote in the newspaper. And that tension between elegance and arrogance would only grow sharper as some players began to resent not just his words, but the way he carried himself on and off the pitch. Franz Beckenbauer wasn't just another player, he was a symbol. On the pitch, he glided where others hustled, read the game instead of chasing it, and made defending look like an art form. Writers compared him to a conductor leading an orchestra. Fans said he looked as if he could play in a tuxedo without breaking a sweat. That effortless style earned him the nickname Der Kaiser, but not everyone admired it. Inside the locker room, there were players who looked at him and saw something very different. In a sport built on sweat, grit, and sacrifice, Beckenbauer seemed detached. He didn't throw himself into tackles with reckless abandon. He didn't look bloodied or battered after 90 minutes. To some, that elegance felt like arrogance. It was as if he was saying, "I don't need to get dirty to dominate this game." For the grinders and hard men of German football, the players who built their careers on sheer determination, that contrast created friction. Imagine you've just spent 90 minutes sliding through mud, chasing every lost ball, and then beside you is Beckenbauer, barely out of breath, hailed as a genius. It was admiration, mixed with envy, but also resentment. They respected him, yes, but many didn't like him. Even opponents noticed. English players famously complained about his cool demeanor, saying it felt like he was mocking them by refusing to break a sweat. That image of aloof superiority seeped into how teammates saw him too. He wasn't just the leader, he was above the team, almost untouchable, and Beckenbauer didn't always go out of his way to bridge the gap. He embraced the image of the aristocrat of football. Off the pitch, he carried himself with a sense of calm superiority, as if drama was beneath him. For ordinary players, that distance could feel like rejection. He wasn't the kind of captain who'd drag everyone into the trenches. He was the general watching the battle from the hilltop. That divide elegance versus grit became part of his legacy. Fans loved it. The media adored it. But for some players in the locker room, it was a wedge that separated der Kaiser from the rest of the men in the trenches. And as Beckenbauer transitioned from the pitch to positions of power, that sense of distance only grew. Because once he left the field and entered the boardroom, new enemies began to surface, not just teammates, but former allies who suddenly weren't so sure they wanted to stand by him anymore. Beckenbauer's story didn't end with his playing days. In fact, some of the most divisive chapters came after he hung up his boots. He became a manager, then an executive, and eventually one of the faces of Germany's successful bid to host the 2006 World Cup. On paper, it was the perfect continuation of a legendary career. But power always brings scrutiny, and this time, the critics were louder than ever. As the 2006 tournament approached, allegations began to surface. Questions about how Germany had secured the World Cup bid led to whispers of corruption and shady dealings. Beckenbauer, once untouchable, suddenly found himself at the center of ethics investigations. For a man who had built his image on elegance and honor, this was a serious blow. And here's where the shift happened. Some of his old teammates and colleagues, men who had once stood proudly beside him, began to quietly distance themselves. They didn't openly attack him after all. He was still der Kaiser. But the silence spoke volumes. Associations, endorsements, and even friendships cooled as people tried to protect themselves from the growing cloud. It wasn't just about the World Cup bid. By then, Beckenbauer's authority had stretched across decades. Some former players felt overshadowed by his constant presence, as if German football revolved around one man and one man only. Others resented how his image, polished, aristocratic, larger than life, left little room for anyone else's story. And when the investigations dragged on, the divide widened. Players who had once admired him started asking tough questions. Was the man they idolized as a player really the same one making backroom deals as an executive? Could they trust him, or had the shine been masking flaws all along? For Beckenbauer, the accusations hurt, but perhaps the quiet skepticism from his own circle stung even more. Legends aren't supposed to fade under suspicion, but in those later years, the glow dimmed. He was still respected, still admired, but the aura of perfection was gone. And for some players, that fall from grace confirmed what they'd always felt deep down. Franz Beckenbauer was never as untouchable as the world believed. But if Beckenbauer's later years showed the cracks in his reputation, the truth is, whispers of resentment had always followed him. Some conflicts were public, some private, and some lived only as rumors. And those rumors tell their own story, that even the greatest legends are never loved by everyone. For every public feud Franz Beckenbauer had, there were countless quieter stories whispered in corridors, locker rooms, and late-night interviews. That's the thing about legends, the bigger the crown, the more shadows it casts. Some of those shadows came from abroad. English players in particular often felt he embodied everything they disliked about German football: cold efficiency, superiority, and a refusal to bow to the gritty, hard man culture the English prided themselves on. Beckenbauer's calm composure, his way of making the game look effortless, came across to them not as genius, but as arrogance. On the pitch, that friction often bubbled up in hard tackles, extra shoves, and lingering resentment that followed him long after the final whistle. Then there were the rumors within Germany itself. Some claimed certain teammates never fully forgave him for his sated and overpaid insult in 1984. Others whispered about power struggles behind the scenes, that Beckenbauer had favorites, that sponsors like Adidas influenced decisions, and that not everyone who wore the German shirt trusted that selections were made fairly. Few dared to say it out loud, but resentment often hides in silence. Even as a manager and executive, the uneasy alliances continued. Some colleagues reportedly felt he took too much credit, putting himself at the center of every story, whether it was a victory on the field or a successful tournament bid. For players who already lived in his shadow, that constant spotlight on Beckenbauer only deepened the divide. And yet here's the paradox: many of those same people who resented him also admired him. They couldn't escape his brilliance, his impact, his aura. That's the strange power of figures like Beckenbauer. You might dislike him, even hate him, but you can't ignore him. Every rumor, every grudge, every whisper of friction only reinforced how much space he occupied in the football world. By the end, it didn't matter whether the stories were true, exaggerated, or simply born from envy. What mattered was that they existed at all. Because if no one resents you, it usually means you haven't risen high enough to cast a shadow, and Beckenbauer's shadow stretched across decades. Franz Beckenbauer will forever be remembered as Der Kaiser, the elegant defender who redefined football. But behind the trophies and the headlines, there was another story, one of tension, resentment, and fractured relationships. Uli Stein sent home in disgrace after mocking him. Tony Schumacher and the lingering goalkeeper wars, teammates stung by his sated and overpaid remark, players who bristled at his aloof style, allies who quietly backed away when scandals touched his later years. 5 examples, 5 cracks in the myth of perfection, and together they reveal something bigger, that greatness always comes with enemies. The higher Beckenbauer climbed, the more people he left behind, whether through arrogance, politics, or simply the weight of his own aura. Was he hated because of who he was, or because of how much he achieved? Maybe it was both. What's certain is that his story proves legends aren't just built on admiration, they're also shaped by conflict, controversy, and the people who dared to stand against them. So the next time you hear the name Der Kaiser, remember this: even the man who seemed untouchable wasn't free from enemies, and maybe that's the truest sign of how powerful he really was.